Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of the Earth. This is Rock and Roll Spot Connection. This is going to be the first of the new segment. It's not going to be a regular segment. It's a segment that's going to be finite, basically. So, oftentimes when I'm talking about comic books, I have a tendency to, to talk shit about the comics, the state of comics in the '90s. There's good reason for that. Now, the thing is, I got into comics in the '90s, and a lot of the stuff that I deride now is actually stuff that drew me in the first place. And to be fair, I do still kind of like some of that stuff. So I thought maybe for those who maybe were not or unaware of what it is I'm talking about, I do a series of videos actually talking about where comics went, what happened with comics in the '90s. And I figure the best way to start is, well, first off, there's going to be a handful of topics. We'll be discussing the companies. Some of them will get their own videos. Others will be done in catch-all videos, which there may be multiples of. Also, the speculators boom. Now, the speculators boom didn't start in the '90s, but it really did. It was happening in full force during the '90s. Gimmicks, which were a huge deal in the '90s, and of course the aftermath, how things ended up going into the 2000s and in the beginning of the 2000s. We won't be so much covering the 2000s or even the 2010s because, well, yeah, there's no stigma to them. Anywho, so the best place to start, I figure, is with a prologue. Kind of how did comics get to the point that they were in the '90s? So, okay. In the '70s, if anything, the '60s, '70s, and '80s firmly established Marvel and DC as the big two, especially the '70s and '80s. The '60s they had competition. Hell, even in the '70s they had competition. But as the '70s wore on, and especially with the '80s, their competition, though it existed, was just kind of, oh yeah, that's who cares about them? This is where it's at. And I mean, Marvel and DC had the money to make it that way. They had the pull. I mean, sheesh. The '60s Batman series is probably still shown in syndication somewhere. Not to mention various animated versions of various Marvel and DC heroes. Yeah. Not many other companies can boast having multiple animated versions of the same character, or even just multiple animated adaptations at all. Anyways, however, the '80s, things were changing though in the '80s. The '80s is probably the point when you first started to get, okay, so the '60s you generally had a concept of, some of the smaller companies had this concept of, hey, we just need about a dozen or so stories, and we just keep on recycling them because, by the time readers, they're not going to stick with it. They're going to get older and be like, oh yeah, I don't want to bother with this anymore. But Marvel and DC are like, no. We're going to keep on telling new stories. Of course, that didn't hold true with X-Men for a little while because it wasn't that popular in the '60s. I know, it's kind of shocking. But the writers began to notice that with the audience aging, you know, the stories probably needed to change at least a little bit, and so we started to get more darker characters showing up in the 70s and 80s, as well as darker storylines. For example, the Punisher, introduced in the early 70s, pretty much just popped up in Marvel Tales magazine for the longest time because Marvel Tales wasn't covered by the Comics Code Authority, which we'll get to that later. And so they had a lot more freedom with what they could do with him there. However, in 1986, Marvel tested the waters for a Punisher series by giving him his own miniseries. It was a success, and a year later, he got his own ongoing. Of course, by this time, the Comics Code Authority rules and regulations they changed at least a little bit. They get a little bit lighter. You know, okay, yeah, you can do these things too. Now here's the kicker. In '88, the Punisher got a second ongoing series in the form of Punisher Wardrobe. Yeah, a guy with all the guns. In the span of the 1980s, got a miniseries and 2 ongoing books that went on into the 90s. For Dark Stories, we got Dark Knight Returns from '86, which ended up being an inspiration, at least partially, for Tim Burton, Christopher Nolan, and Zack Snyder. Watchmen in '86 and '87, which many view as being one of the best, if not the best, comic books or graphic novels ever made. Batman: The Killing Joke from '88, considered to be the definitive Joker story, at least, or at the very least, the definitive Batman versus the Joker story. Wolverine debuted in '74, joins the X-Men in '75, becomes popular as hell, gets a miniseries in '82, another one in '84, and then finally in '88 an ongoing. And then, of course, we had the smaller publishers, some of whom didn't bother with the Comics Code Authority, which allowed writers and artists more freedom. Now, the Comics Code Authority was created in the 50s. It was created in the aftermath of a book called Seduction of the Innocent by Dr. Frederick Wertham. In many ways, it's a more it's reefer madness for comic books, and so yeah. And it's the reason why there are a lot of just really why so many stories from especially the 50s and 60s are so just tongue-in-cheek, because the Comics Code Authority was there to say, yeah, hey, you can't do that. There were some instances in the 70s of Marvel and DC eschewing the Comics Code on very rare occasion. As I recall, there was an issue of Amazing Spider-Man wherein that deals with Harry Osborn being addicted to drugs, and since he's not a villain, it's not being dealt with as, oh, this is oh, that's a problem. Oh, this is a problem I have to beat up. The code authority refused to approve it. The Green Arrow Green Lantern story wherein Speedy, Green Lantern's sidekick, is revealed to be doing drugs. that also, as I recall, did not get code approval. But anyways, a lot of comics, a lot of the smaller or rather indie publishers, as they would refer as a catch-all term for them at that point, they didn't bother with the code authority, mainly because they didn't feel the need to. There are various reasons, but for one thing, Marvel and DC, especially at this point in time, were still being carried in supermarkets and bookstores on what's regularly referred to as a spin rack, spinning racks, or whatever. They were usually brought in with the books, I presume at least. By the time I started working in a major retailer that might carry comic books on occasion, they'd stop carrying comic books, so I didn't know how it worked. But I presume they were handled the same way that other periodicals were. So anyway, some of those those smaller publishers included Mirage, which is best known for the Ninja Turtles, which was a very different book than the cartoon that it inspired. They came about in 1983. The Ninja Turtles were actually basically supposed to make fun of all the major, all the things that were big in comics at the time: teenagers, Teen Titans, mutants, X-Men, ninjas, Daredevil. Well, in fact, to be honest, Frank Miller's run on Daredevil. He had Dark Horse, which was founded in '86. They really gained prominence through licensed comics. Aliens, Predator, Star Wars, Indiana Jones. They ended up having quite. And that actually managed to get them. They appealed to a fan base. Now, while Indiana Jones and Star Wars, you don't have to worry about anything risque. Alien and Predator, well, if nothing else, gruesome violence. Which, of course, the code is very much against, especially with the way it shot down horror comics back in the 50s. Anyway, there's Malibu Comics, which also formed in '86. Eventually they would end up being bought out by Marvel in the '90s. Before that they had bought out Eternity and Aircell Comics. Some of the stuff that they actually were the company that published the original Men in Black comic books that inspired the film franchise. Another thing that was kind of beginning to be an issue is creator relations. Now, up to that point, most characters were considered to be created as work for hire. Sure, you might get the occasional, so-and-so created by thus and such. Batman comics, everyone says Batman created by Bob Kane. Or Bob Kane and Bill Finger. They might be acknowledging Finger now, I'm not sure. Let's just say Finger got the finger for a long time from him. Superman created by Joel Siegel, by Siegel and Schuster, stuff like that. But that was just the extent of it, just we acknowledge you created this character. That's it. And the creators had no say. A couple prime examples of this. Elektra, who was created by Frank Miller for the sheer purpose of being killed later on in his run on Daredevil. And apparently the idea was bandied about for quite some time about bringing her back. And when she was, because of her being brought back, at least Frank Miller wants nothing. Seems to want nothing. From what I can been able to glean from interviews and whatnot, Frank Miller wants nothing to do with Marvel. I mean, aside from, I'm sure if they said, "Hey, you want to appear in an episode of Daredevil?" He'd probably say, "Sure, how much?" But he's not going to write or draw for them. Cable was another example. We'll get more into Cable, however, in the Marvel segment, a portion of this. Anyways, so also you had some creators that would go to smaller publishers, sell stories that they couldn't tell with the big two, or stories that didn't really fit into any of the niches of the big two. And the idea with the stories they couldn't tell would be, yeah, I want to tell this story, it's very... These characters they're similar, but I want to tell this story for this book, but I can't, so instead I'm going to change up the characters and, maybe even change some of the circumstances. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much how the state of things. Oh yeah, I actually forgot one thing. Two things actually. So, one thing that was also beginning to happen was more. Supposedly, artists had fan bases that were devoted to the point of, oh, this artist is leaving this book. Well, I'm leaving it too. Though, personally, I don't really think that was so much of a case. It's possible, sure. I mean, I would honestly think it was more a case of, oh, this artist is leaving this book that I've been invested in for a while and going to this book. Well, I guess I'll start picking up this book too. Also, you had the beginnings of the big event crossovers. Now, crossovers had been going on little by little, and in fact, in the late 80s, going into the 90s, it was common for Marvel's X-Men books to do crossovers within the team, within themselves. Mutant Massacre, Inferno, so on and so forth. But the event crossovers, however, those really rose into prominence starting in the 80s. But with Crisis on Infinite Earths and Marvel Superhero Secret Wars and Marvel Superhero Secret Wars 2. Which would kind of lay the brickwork for, what was to come. Which, in fact, that was kind of the first few steps in what became, the event age, which we are kind of sort of still stuck in, where you get an event, it goes on for 6 to 8 months, it ends, things are back to normal, and but really we're building towards another event. 6 to 8 months go by, comics storylines get interrupted, and yeah. So, yeah, this is the beginning of comics in the 90s segment. I don't want to call it a documentary. This is the beginning of my comics in the 90s video set thing. Probably going to be doing about 1, 2, 3. There'll probably be at least 10 videos in this whole, when all this is said and done. But anyway, that's it for today. We'll be back in the near future with another installment of building the team. It'll be a more traditional installment where I'm just putting together a team rather than putting the yesterday's unboxed or sealed team build or the the Heroic Age Avengers one that I did a couple weeks ago. So yeah, this will be a more, like I said, a more traditional building team, and that'll be up. We'll be doing it either tomorrow or the next day. Anyway, and as I mentioned before, like last week's comic roundup, this week will probably also be slightly delayed for reasons. Anyway, as always, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Comment if you want. Hit the notification icon to be notified when I put up new content. Links to Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon in the description box down below. This is Rock and Roll Spock signing off, saying live long and rock hard.